Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
The governing logic here is don't worry because, the people that we are punishing are the bad guys, right? You can speak just as long as it's not bad. And the language that gets used here is just sort of patently authoritarian to the point that one wonders like whether they hear themselves, that like these people are dangerous to society, right?
Welcome everyone once again to the Roundtable, the American Minds weekly podcast here at the Claremont Institute. I'm your host, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute, publisher of the Claremont Review Books and the American Mind, joined by Spencer Klavan, associate editor of the Claremont Review Books and the American Mind, Matthew Peterson, vice president of education, founding editor of the American Mind, Seth Barron, managing editor of the American Mind, and last but not least, James Poulos, executive editor of the American Mind. Welcome everyone. I'm going to see week by week how fast I can do the intro because we have such a loyal listenership that we need not dwell on such formalities. Anyway, we thought we'd open today with a bit of discussion about the hottest new thing in social media, although it's not that new as far as these things go, and that is Clubhouse. What is Clubhouse, you say? Well, many of our listeners, well-informed as they are, know exactly what it is. It's basically like a bunch of chat rooms that you can drop into at any time that are conference calls. And it's a slick little app, pretty easy to use. The UI is pretty good. I think it's part of why it's become so popular. It launched, I think, in March of 2020. Is that right, Jake? He can confirm. And has really taken off in the last couple of months. It was kind of a space for celebrities to go and do stuff. And then, the sort of more clued in Silicon Valley types and others have been using it for the last, 8 or 10 months. But it just has taken off in the last 6 weeks or so and is spreading into the political media commentary ecosystem rapidly. It's invite only, so it's throttled in a way from really blowing up. It also keeps it somewhat non-insane. And James and Matt and I, at least recently, have been playing around with it a bit. It's fun for us here at Claremont because a lot of, you usually only can come into chat rooms and see chat rooms at 1 or 2 steps removed from your friends. I don't know if that's fully true, but I'm pretty sure I'm not seeing everything that's going on Clubhouse. And it sends you notifications. And for us, half the time at a certain time of night, if people are discussing politics, media, big tech, 2 to 5 to even sometimes 8 or 9 people commenting. And then there's a whole nother audience below the commenters. And the moderator can pull up an audience member to comment whenever they like or kick someone out, and you can leave without really causing any trouble. So it's a pretty fluid conversational structure, and we end up seeing a lot of Claremont fellows on there and friends of Claremont. So it's been interesting if, kind of a waste of time. I mean, the conference call aspect of it is like any conference call. It can kind of drone on and on. People can be long-winded, and, you have better things to do on a Tuesday night. After your wife's cooked you dinner, then screw around on Clubhouse. But it's been an interesting social and media phenomenon for us, and it's broken into the mainstream ecosystem in a somewhat negative way, which has only fueled its rise. Which is Taylor Lorenz, the horrible millennial news writer that's very much in scare quotes at the New York Times, along with a co-author, sort of elevated Clubhouse to a new level of infamy and attraction for many on the right because she lamented the fact that unfettered conversations were going on Clubhouse, including, misogynistic, racist, anti-Semitic conversations. We haven't stumbled into any of those, but like anything else, a fairly unregulated space where people can talk with each other invites its fair share of trolls occasionally. So anyway, it's a I forget how James put it before we launched this episode, but he'll repeat himself, I'm sure. But it's kind of the new frontier of a certain kind of social media and it's taking off and causing some gnashing of teeth and consternation on the left. And so that's reason for optimism and excitement in many ways. We'll see how it goes. I throw the floor open.
Well, yeah, it is as you describe. I guess I should observe that I am technically still on friendly terms with Taylor, despite her elevation to the top of the hate hierarchy. It was simpler times, back like 4, 5, 6 years ago. There were these things called happy hours where you were allowed to go out in public and like get really drunk together and like yell in each other's faces and have a good time. And so, we were fixtures of the DC happy hour scene in those simpler times. But it's been remarkable, since then to see the New York Times go from an institution that, everyone wanted to be involved with if you were in political media, even if you were the sort of the furthest to the right and you were a working political journalist or pundit person in Washington. Of course, you wanted the New York Times to publish your op-ed. It was the best you could do. And to go, everyone's sort of been whipsawed going from that moment to, the moment when the Times goes, you know what, it's not really about all the news that's fit to print. It's about all the juicy narratives that we can sort of jam up your nose into your brainstem. And then have to sort of recalibrate at the same time or in quick succession, basically trying to enforce a kind of, religious creed in the workplace. All of these things have left the Times, I think, reeling, despite the fact that it's the most powerful institution in media, and has left ordinary people and very unusual tech nerds, God bless them, alike, to say, this institution is malfunctioning and it's invading our lives in a way that is not welcome. And it's doing this because it can't provide us a service that we want anymore. And, times have changed. The news isn't what we need to make sense of the moment and to figure out how to move with some agency into our lives. And the way that the Times has chosen to handle that is one that has created an out and out conflict between tech and media, to paint with the broadest possible brush. And the front line of that conflict is Clubhouse. You can jump on and be in the chat about whether the New York Times whether it would be better off without the New York Times even existing anymore. That's a huge sea change in the way Americans think about media and think about institutions that are ostensibly there to provide, a sort of quasi-public service, and now seem to be acting like an enemy. Or at the very least, an extremely, extremely nosy, snobbish, chastising sort of like member of a cult who lives next door.
There's a really weird feature of all this, which is that the sort of one of the biggest news stories in American politics is what is happening internally at the New York Times. And of course, the Times is ill-equipped to cover or process that because the people involved are in the heart of it. I mean, the internal climate of the Times, I have it on good authority, is like becoming increasingly impossible for anybody to navigate in the mode of that sort of bipartisan camaraderie that you described, James, as part of the sort of DC circuit. I mean, that's it's not uniquely American. It is distinctive in America. But look, I mean, on the floor of Parliament, the peers and the lords are famous for screaming at one another back and forth and then going out for a pint afterward. That clubbable, to turn a phrase, sense of kind of tolerance and open exchange of views. There are still people involved at the Times that have some sort of aspiration to that old ideal, but there's really no coexisting between that ideal and this new, quite expressly or almost expressly religious sort of purity cult. And so what's going on in Clubhouse is something, albeit totally unrecognizable structurally compared to what's going on in the Times. It's something much closer to the yelling at each other's faces late into the night after however many Bellinis or whatever, or martinis, like that Clubhouse is kind of taking up that mantle. The hostility of people like Taylor Lorenz to it represents a very serious philosophical commitment to not allowing, not just not letting people say what they want at the Times, but to not allowing American people to say what they want without supervision. If the Times, as currently constituted, had its way, there would be no such venues where you weren't checked up upon by Taylor Lorenz and her fetters. It's the opposite of an unfettered conversation is one that takes place among people in fetters. And so, to me, this kind of amounts to a creedal statement of faith that there shall be no Americans without metaphorical fetters upon themselves. And I think Matt and I were talking earlier, and maybe let's talk more about just whether Clubhouse can survive, whether a sort of renegade media operation like this won't just simply be intolerable to the ruling elites.
Yeah, what you're saying, Spencer, I kind of helped me synthesize the dynamic. And we were saying before we started the podcast or started recording, I mean, the NSA is always recording. So, at some point, both at the end of time when God shows everything to everyone, and a little before that when the NSA shows everything to everyone first.
When we're all gathered, both the NSA and Jake are always recording. Sorry.
That's right.
Yes. It'll be revealed. But there is an aspect to Clubhouse that could be a turnoff because it's kind of elitist, right? I mean, the whole cool thing about it is that you do need an invite. But I'm old enough to remember, as they say, when I was proud of getting a early Gmail invite, oh yeah, that's a great way to roll out a product that ultimately is going to be popular. But you gain status and you roll it out in a way where you do need an invite to get there. So I don't think it's actually as exclusive as people think. But that's a great way to roll it out. People are not familiar with that, and it increases the sexiness. The important thing here, and I think that why it's pissing off the New York Times, why it's pissing off Taylor and others, is that it's clear the people on here who are expressing wrong thing or dallying with, ideas that they should not have, not be talking about publicly in an unfettered way, is because those people are, in a broad sense, elite, in a neutral sense, right? I mean, they're young, smart kids from good schools. They're people who are kind of known in different circles and on Twitter or social media. And so you have this collection of people who you can't immediately say are low status. I think this is the secret, the dynamic that's going on and why the New York Times and others are so pissed about Clubhouse. And it's not like, Parler. So Parler, you could say, if you're a fancy pants, you can say, oh, well, Dan Bongino associated with Parler, and that's just a bunch of white supremacists, domestic extremists, and blah blah blah. And you can turn it off and say, well, that's bad. It deserves to be dissected in front of the entire country and destroyed by every entity that has power over it. Whereas Clubhouse is protected in a way by the high status tech folks who started it and who are shilling for it, like Mark Andreessen and his company and others. They're all over the platform. And there's people on the platform who obviously you can't just peg as deplorables, and they're speaking publicly about topics they shouldn't be speaking about. And that is what pisses people off. And what they can sense is really what's happened with Clubhouse is that these, elite or high status individuals have created a safe space for, God forbid, free speech. Mark Andreessen and others have created a safe space for people to actually discuss things together freely, and that angers them because they can't just cancel it in the same way that they did to Parler and they have done to other platforms. So that's very different. And my take on this, which I'll just say over and over again, is that this is going to come to a head. And what I love about it is that it has its ups and downs. I could talk about its downsides too. But it's very interesting because it's an entirely new version of social media that is audio. It's based on audio, which is very personal, fireside chat. You're actually talking to people you kind of know and some people you do know, and they're all together and there's a big room, but it doesn't feel like it's a big room. and it's exciting, and it's new, and it's really inventive. I think it really is a very powerful new dynamic being formed by this platform, and it's just clear the powers that be are not going to let this happen. They are not going. There is no way that Andreessen and everyone else who's publicly associated with forming this platform aren't going to face increasing pressure from the powers that be, because one segment of it, it's not even the whole thing. There's a lot of people, a lot of wokesters. I just saw today, Aaron Sorkin is shilling, a room with Bill Gates, coming up on Clubhouse. It's not all the people who are against the narrative, but the people who are against the narrative are on there. And at some point, the people who have invested in and run this new business are going to face criticism and then pressure. And it's inevitable. And what they do in the face of that pressure is going to be very interesting. Up until now, anyone who's resisted the Borg has been crushed. I mean, Gab, Parler, these platforms have been crushed. And at some point, someone's going to say something stupid, or some actual idiot's going to be in there saying bad things. And it's going to be used. The narrative is already building that Clubhouse is bad. It's allowing unfettered speech. And at that point, we're going to see if some of the tech guys and business guys who started it are willing to say, you know what, screw you. We're keeping this space free. And if they do, this will be a significant moment in American culture right now, in politics. And if they don't,
what's Elon's acronym, Matt, that you coined?
Yeah, well, Elon Musk, if you don't know, and you should know, the great thing about this is he didn't intend this to be public. There's no indication he intended this to be public at all. But the Washington Post is doing a story on how his business is overvalued, and they finally reach him and email for comment, right? And what he said was, give my regards. Give my regards to your puppet master. And it's a great acronym if you just take the first letters of each one of those words, which should be everyone's response to a journalist at all times. I mean, he just said, give my regards to your puppet master. That's it. Didn't even know this would be reported. The Washington Post reports it as if this is, an L for Musk. So, and you could see them on Twitter. Like, can you imagine saying this to a reporter? I mean, and of course, all of Twitter erupts because Musk is a hero for having that attitude. If Clubhouse maintains that, give my regards to your overlord, give me regards to your puppet master. I don't care what you say in New York Times. We are the new leaders, and we will allow a safe space for free speech and debate here on our platform. Clubhouse will become, a cultural moment that's very, very important right now. It's vital. If they cock, right? If they break in some way, it'll be very disappointing, and it'll be another sign that this cultural revolution, another sign to a lot of people watching that the cultural revolution is inexorable and lead to a lot of doom and gloom. So I don't know what will happen, but all I'm saying is this conflict is coming, and that is inevitable.
I have a question for the group based on the stakes of what Matt's describing, because it seems like almost impossible that there won't be a crisis point of exactly the kind that you outline. And one of the things that I feel was revealed to me in the course of the sort of January 6th debacle, in the wake of that, and the just sudden kind of lockstep clampdown on Trump and Trumpism that happened all over the social media platforms. We all watched, our follower counts drain for no reason and all this stuff. It seemed to me as if one of the things that we were finally coming to terms with after people like us ranting about it forever is that, like, these companies shouldn't have this much power, for good or ill. Like, they shouldn't be able to say yay or nay about whether our conversations are to be unfettered. And the centralization of that, which is not just like a section, or rather not just an antitrust concern to me, but a deeper regime level constitutional concern about, companies gaining the power to basically nullify the First Amendment. More power to Clubhouse. I'm very excited about it. It seems like a great new platform. It also seems like if we're just going to port all of our eggs into this one other new basket, it's like it's not all going to belong to Twitter now. It's all instead going to belong to Clubhouse, and it's all on whether Clubhouse stands or falls. It seems, isn't that kind of only part of the solution? Like, don't we just sort of need a bunch of these places and various different venues? I mean, one feature of Clubhouse that's kind of nice actually is that it doesn't feel centralized in quite the same way that Twitter does. There are these crevices of it, and it's not quite clear, at least as of yet, that there are like Clubhouse stars, so much as that there are just like interesting things conversations that emerge. But I guess I wonder whether we are sort of walking into a trap by like placing all this weight on this one app rather than kind of taking it as a model for a bunch of new stuff that might emerge.
Just real quick. I mean, I want other people to answer. I'll just say two sentences. I don't think everything relies on Clubhouse. I mean, I think it's an unlooked for ray of sunshine in an otherwise dark landscape. It's hilarious to me how it's turned out, whether by design or not, to include these conversations. And I think the nature of the medium, because it's an audio form of social media or digital subsuming audio, it is very much just conducive to our line of thinking and our way of seeing the world and spreading it in a kind of, you could make at least an analogy to radio, right? To like Rush or whatever. But that kind of conversation with real people, the personal aspect of it without the snark and the posturing, different form of posturing, it all leads in a certain direction. But I'm not sitting here saying, oh, it's the great new hope or anything like that. I just think it's an unlooked for ray of light in the currently dark landscape.
I mean, there's always going to be, it's like grass pushing up between the cracks of the sidewalk. There's a need for expression, there's a need for community, and the more they, every time they shut one thing down, it's going to find another outlet. I haven't been on this app, Clubhouse, but from everything I'm hearing, it sounds like there'd be a pretty clear choke point where they can institute controls, like who can moderate sessions, who can join them. I don't know. I can't imagine that, as you said, Matt, I can't imagine that if things started to get out of control that they would allow it to. It seems like this would be pretty easy to rein in and essentially smother this this impulse towards free expression, but then I guess there'll be something else. I mean, it does feel like we're moving towards some kind of samizdat culture where everything's going to have to be underground in some way. I don't know if we're going to have to dig out old mimeograph machines for anyone who remembers those, but something like that.
Well, yeah, I think, just to loop back to Matt, some of what you were laying out there, there is a school of thought that is gaining some currency in tech circles that Walter Ong is the media theorist who needs your attention. Ong is a McLuhan protege. He argued that what was being retrieved as the primary communications mode in our lives was oral communication rather than text-based communication. What I think that school of thought misses, although they're not wrong as far as it goes, is that the writing and the recordation that is still more powerful than anything, even human speech, is just being done by robots, not by humans. And so, I don't think we're going to be pivoting into a world that is more oral, but not more wedded to the recordation of the machines. That said, I think Clubhouse is a good example of the fact that people can use technology to limit the control over their lives by machines. There, as far as I know, are no recorded. There's no recorded audio on Clubhouse. They do not archive any of the audio, and that by itself is a big FU to like a digital bot, because that entity is there to do nothing more or less with regard to us and our hopes and dreams and values and concerns than record what it is we say and do and possibly think as far as it goes. And for that to be deliberately removed as a feature of the product is, I think, a reminder that, you know, we can proceed into, you know, the frontiers of life with a society that is richly endowed with technology without having to surrender our agency and our identity to whatever the machines do to us.
What it does is, by letting the human speech go into the void, into our, you know, into other people's minds who are listening and then disappear, it brings us back. It's very much like Ong, who Peter Ramus dissertation, Harvard guy back when it meant something. Orality. I mean, we are moving towards, like you said. I mean, it's true as far as it goes. We're moving towards a kind of oral culture again, where you can actually have very sophisticated, you know, thought and art and all of that. I mean, that was very much my Viking ancestors. You know, they didn't write a lot down except the runes, but these were wordy people, and we are moving to that. But what you're saying, the bravery to take away the one aspect of digital, which is to record the voice, it allows for something to blossom that has a ton of energy. And that's, I think, the power of Clubhouse, right? I mean, that's so true. By saying we're not going to record any of this, unlike everything you write down in text, but we are going to use digital to let you speak to each other. It allows for a kind of human energy to grow, and that's where my doomerism comes in. I think that's so dangerous to the regime or the party. I can't see them letting it continue.
Well, at a broader level, right? I mean, this sort of retrieval of orality is, of course, like makes for an even deeper shift than some of the shifts in medium to which digital has been compared. Like, for example, the invention of the printing press, right? Which doesn't actually transform or like just doesn't detextualize us, doesn't sort of remove text as the sort of most advanced technology of communication, but just sort of makes us better at making text. The closest analog is to the kind of revolution in classical studies that occurred when like Milman, Perry, and Albert Lord started to say, well, actually, maybe Homer was sort of akin to these bards, these oral poets that we've discovered in Eastern Europe, and suddenly the very nature of the thing itself was transformed, and our reading of Homer was transformed, and so also was our understanding of these moments in Plato where he's genuinely worried, like not kidding around about his concerns regarding what will happen when this sort of nubile, subtle, intuitive, relational form of philosophy that was Socratic discourse, this kind of like ineffable, impossible to pin down relationship that transformed the lives of everyone it touched. What was going to happen when that had to somehow be crystallized and made immobile, as he said, like statues rather than living plants, right? And that does speak, I think, really deeply to like the difference between a clubhouse
and he meant written down, right, Spencer? Just to clarify for our listeners, yeah,
that's right. Yeah, sorry. Writing things for Plato was like a real problem. The technology of writing was
the words can't speak back. I mean, you ask a question in the text and they can't answer you like a person.
That's right. That's right. And they don't, submit themselves to your kind of desire for nuance in quite the same way. I mean, like, look, long story short, this is why Plato writes dialogues. I mean, there's like an effort there to kind of carry over into text the ineffability of orality of like an oral culture. But the difference between a clubhouse and a podcast is that like not being recorded, and everybody struggles with this who records podcasts, right? Like not being recorded simply changes the way in which you express yourself. There's like a performativity to knowing right now in this conversation, as well as we know each other, as much fun as we have together, like we are outward facing in the discussions that we have in a way that like people on Clubhouse are sort of released from being. And that shift is not actually like reducible to what will or won't happen with the battle between the New York Times and Clubhouse ultimately, right? Like that's a very profound change in the way that we are currently sort of thinking about how we how we communicate. And it's like pretty welcome. I mean, one of the things we were talking about was fatigue, was like performance fatigue on Clubhouse. I think like that's kind of a pre-Clubhouse mentality, the idea that this requires of you some kind of like, thing that will be etched in stone for all time. The way I think about Clubhouse, and I think like, oh, I have to, I have to be on again. But I'm not sure that everybody's thinking about it that way. That might be part of its appeal.
Well, Spencer, I'll tell you this, like, I'm not going to think about this after I drink enough beers while I'm doing this podcast and then go on Clubhouse and say whatever I want.
Right.
So, that's going to be fun. But I agree that that performative, I'd say that's the downside. And the downside is that the kind of two-tier conversation that I see going on at Clubhouse are people who are from a broader or deeper tradition, or who have some kind of education, maybe it's in its own bubble, who speak a certain language, and then they go on there and they're already the hardcores. They already see, I think there's a crisis in the country or whatever. And then you see a lot of people who are, generally top 20% by whatever metric, elite, quote unquote, well-educated by the standards of our times or whatever. And they're very technocratic. And so, but the people who are drawn to the interesting groups are from the technocracy, and they see that something's gone awry, something's amiss. So, if you're listening, thinking like, use fancy pants, all of you. Well, these are the fancy pants who are kind of on your side. Like they see there's something wrong with the New York Times, whatever. They went to a fancy school, they have a fancy job, right? But they're drawn to these hardcore people who are saying there's something really wrong here. But the problem is like the discourse, quote unquote, on Clubhouse is very much for me like a translation game, like people trying to translate to an elite audience what's wrong in a way that doesn't just offend them. Like most of them don't have Spencer's hardcore grasp of the classics or whatever. And so you can't just come out and say like, well, Plato says this and this is wrong and this is right. And so there's kind of a translation language that they all use in these discussions. And that's very weird. I mean, it's a very strange thing. It's probably necessary and good. It's strange to me. I'm just going to be the guy who goes on and says over and over again the same things. Like, they're all going to cancel your asses, and some of you are going to have to put skin in the game. Well, I'll be that guy, no problem. And the other problem they have is actually really interesting to what you're saying, is that you need to have guided discussions. That's an art. It's an art, and it's very difficult skill to be able to guide discussions where you let different people talk, you ask guided questions, you cut certain people off. And I could see something, going back to the other side of the scribal age, as James would say, going back to the medieval age, where you'd have a real role on something like Clubhouse for masters of guiding discussion.
Power moderators.
It's necessary because otherwise the discussions become interminable.
Yeah, something like a Clubhouse power moderator. There are also just... we should just wrap this section up by saying there's some off the beaten path stuff, and I have a couple anecdotes. The off the beaten path stuff. So at night there's like a lullaby Clubhouse where it's just people doing sort of soothing music in a group. I didn't really stay in there long because I thought it was a little weird. But there's some, I saw some game show of sorts. I didn't really dip into it because it didn't look that interesting, but there's everything going on. There's also, I think it's exciting too for a certain segment of just interested layperson who's trying to think all these things through, which you've already described this type, Matt. But so last night we were in a conversation for maybe 15 minutes, and just a kid named Chris, who's going to school in Canada. That's all I'll say about him because this is all supposed to be anonymous, came on and said, I have a question for Ryan. Love your Twitter feed. And then he proceeds with a question about the GOP or something. And then he says, what's up with the Claremont Institute being in Claremont? Because I'm thinking of going to Claremont McKenna and transferring out of my woke school. I used to be a Bernie bro, and now I'm like a closet conservative, and my neighbors think I'm a fascist if I voice my opinion. So I need to go somewhere where I can. And so I said, contact me offline and I can tell you about Claremont. And so, that there's a room for that kind of blossoming networking too. And I'll just finally add, everyone's probably been thinking it as they've listened. The way to supercharge Clubhouse, of course, which is what's happening, is to be in like day 366 of nationwide lockdown, depending on where you are, nationwide or, continent-wide. This kid was in Canada. So I think that's also providing fuel to the fire too. the people who haven't been able to go out to their happy hours, who aren't lucky enough to live in Florida or North Dakota, are seizing this opportunity for some community outside of their narrow circles and familial circles that they've been confined to for months and months and months. So our next topic is really, Matt and I were in a group the other night talking about it with some interesting folks, and that is this interesting letter from a couple of I think they're energy subcommittee or energy committee members. It doesn't really matter. Anna Eshoo and Jerry McInerney. They're both California congressmen, and they sent letters to AT&T, Verizon, Roku, Amazon, Apple, Comcast, Charter, Dish, Cox, Altus, and Hulu, as well as Alphabet, Google's parent company. And really the money quote from that was this: what moral or ethical principles, including those related to journalistic integrity, violence, medical information, and public health — I'm sure you all can read between the lines for those. That's January 6th and COVID — do you apply in deciding which channels to carry or when to take adverse actions against a channel? And then they asked if these carriers were planning to continue carrying Fox News, Newsmax, and OANN. These same networks, this was later in the letter, also have been key vectors of spreading misinformation related to the pandemic, as well as information that fueled misinformation about the 2020 elections, November 2020 elections. So this is interesting, and it sparked in the room Matt and I were in. We don't mean to get too solipsistic about it, but it was interesting, a sort of an argument between the libertarians and the conservatives on this question. And it raises a theme of this podcast since its inception, really, which is what's the role of the state, or what's the role of constitutionalism, or how ought our constitutional arguments to situate themselves when, you have private companies sort of doing the bidding of the state in suppressing free speech under the guise of quashing misinformation, especially in the current political environment where the commanding heights of culture and politics as of November think that the misinformation party is their opponent party. This seems to be an escalation in the wars over freedom of speech in big tech, and also the limits of private enterprise. We should note, of course, that most of these providers are quasi, or a lot of them. These providers have been under utility laws in America for decades and decades, sort of oligopolies or even monopoly providers in their certain areas. So it raises, again, all these questions about the public square and our access to it.
Well, it's very interesting that, this same argument was voiced by people on CNN and the other major networks and cable news organizations just a week or two ago. Ryan Stelter on CNN was saying, it's really not a question of freedom of speech, it's a question of freedom of reach. And so why should these organizations that purvey disinformation and hateful rhetoric and incite violence, why should they be allowed to, and the way they were describing it really was like pouring their bile into the ears of America. So, it's interesting that, I guess when major media corporations are communicating so obviously with the reigning political party, to pretend that there's a real division between the public and private there.
Right.
It's really like the Democratic Party has outsourced its spokesperson function to private media. So, what's the difference?
Yeah, and what's the solution? Well, and it's an interesting evolution for the left, right? Because when our public airways were much more constrained, they wanted the fairness doctrine. So you had to give equal time to all points of view. It's one of these interesting evolutions in recent decades on the left side of the political spectrum.
Yeah, and for some time you've gotten the not incorrect observation that woke propaganda or fake news or whatever you want to call it is itself misinformation, right? In addition to that, we're now in a situation where the assumption is being called into question, the assumption behind the concept of misinformation, which is that information is good. And the reason why the established media is in such trouble is not simply that they are pelting us daily with misinformation of their own, because after all, like, that's what broadcast media is it's coming up with a spin on things and pushing that out and trying to make people share in it. But audiences now are starting to ask themselves, like, is information even something I need more of? Do I not, in fact, simply want less information? Has information gone in my life from something good and helpful that, like, increases my ability to function to something overwhelming and baffling and something which I have no time to parse on my own, even if I was able to or felt like it? Something that makes me worse off rather than better off. And I think, that is as responsible for the shifting sands of the politics of the media as anything.
I mean, there was a joke in the Soviet Union that, oh, we have freedom of speech. You just can't lie. And that seems to be what, people like Brian Stelter and, the entire left believes now. I mean, actually, probably a majority of the country seems to believe that. You can say whatever you want. You just can't lie.
Yeah.
I
And
came across
the latitudinariness of your definition of lie, sort of expands and contracts with your political views, I guess.
I came across recently a Twitter exchange thread. I don't know what to call it exactly, in which some inconsequential but revealing lefty was mouthing off about. Well, we have freedom. This is this old saw, right? You can have freedom of speech, but you don't have freedom from consequences. So you need to be ready to suffer the consequences for your speech, like being punched in the face or sent to jail. Those are, potential consequences that we might suffer for saying the wrong thing, apparently. And, getting relative to those consequences, the punishment of being kicked off of major news platforms should come as a blessing to us. So we should be grateful, I think, for being treated so leniently. I do think there is a remarkable moral naivete. I think I've remarked upon this before on the podcast, but there is a kind of shocking moral naivete among the very people who, when I was in like high school and even grade school, seemed to me that they were constantly warning me never to forget the atrocities of the 20th century and authoritarianism and the kind of constant Hitler comparisons that we've been treated to over the past 4 years are sort of an intensification and extremity of this same mentality. Well, our all of our ethical efforts should be focused on avoiding the logic that allowed Hitler and Mussolini to do such terrible things to people, and the comparisons between that and Sulla abounded and all this stuff. Now it seems as if like the governing logic here is, don't worry, because the people that we are punishing are the bad guys, right? You can speak just as long as it's not bad, and the language that gets used here is just sort of patently authoritarian to the point that one wonders like whether they hear themselves. That like these people are dangerous to society, right? That the domestic terrorists who are trying to shut up might cause disturbances of the peace.
Spencer, they might defecate on your desk. And I mean, that's insurrection. I mean, that's how you overthrow a regime. You defecate on someone's desk, you overthrow the regime. We all know this.
This is a fair point. You're right. And if you attain unto defecation, then you have achieved an insurrectionary coup. But I find it perplexing to a certain extent. I mean, look, whatever complexities we want to admit of when it comes to sort of government involvement in setting the parameters of speech, I think there's a really, we have been arguing for many a moon that like one interest the government has is that neutrality is not the way to like achieving a free public square. That the government doesn't just take its hands out of speech and then, everybody is free to speak. And, Amazon and Target and Google and Facebook and all these people and the cancellation of all these books about transgenderism just very recently sort of prove this point. So we all acknowledge that there are complexities there, but the simplicity of this heuristic, like just the sort of obvious, the obvious analog between it and all of the things that the same people were telling me in high school, like never ever allow this kind of logic into your, even remotely near your headspace, because if you do, the next step is prescriptions. The next step is the gulag. Like, be sure to purge yourself of this. I find this, and maybe this is naive on my part, I find this remarkable and quite perplexing that this is sort of something that just seems reasonable to people at this point.
Well, I think it used to be that you would hear this from the left because they assumed that they would always be the ones getting the boot on their neck.
Right.
This is why we would just constantly hear about the evils of McCarthyism, and how that was essentially the equivalent of Maoist purges or something. I mean, even though there really was, they were talking. They always call it a witch hunt, but there really were communists.
Oh, yeah.
There were no witches. So I think that, in the same way that we don't really hear the left complain too much about big money in politics, now that they have all the money in politics, they don't seem to be too worried about censorship. I think it's just a question. It's like a whom question. And so, yeah, they don't really care. I think that they don't. I guess this is like an old theme, but I don't think they really are that concerned with the niceties of their own logical consistency.
Yeah, for a while it was impressing itself upon me and I think us that actually people don't really experience cognitive dissonance in quite the way that you would hope or expect them to. McCarthy's a really good example because the avowed existence of communists, avowed among Republicans and Democrats, was like a premise of McCarthy's excesses. Like, he's post Alger Hiss, it's not as if that was this sort of imaginary fantasy, and the kind of like the spin campaign that ensued afterward, which turned like McCarthyism into a scarier word than communism, is a kind of similar. There's an analog here to what's going on, right? That like the premise of this whole thing is that like you're not supposed to be authoritarian, and that's the premise for being an authoritarian.
No, and that's exactly right. And you have to think about, what's going on here though is strange, because it's not that the left is, of course, against using the power of the state to enforce their speech codes. They absolutely are, and they are proceeding as fast as they can to make that happen. But what's really going on in the recent debates with these letters about Fox News and so forth is that they are putting governmental pressure upon private corporations, large private corporations. And what I find hilarious, right, and you either laugh or cry, and so I choose to laugh, is that the very definition of fascism is that you would harness the power of large corporations to enact the policies of state. And so what you see in these letters is this pathetic attempt, but it could very well be successful, to tell large corporations you had better get with the program and destroy and rip apart these companies that in some way you support or enable. And there's no sense of hypocrisy, of course, on their part. They know exactly what they're doing, and they're pushing it. And what's interesting is it's not as if they are completely. Look, the left wants to destroy the Constitution, the principles of the American regime, whatever that even means anymore, right? But this really is just a pressure push. It's just to use their power, the power of the state, to push private corporations, and you see them do it. And what's interesting is the reaction from so many on the right and the left is, I get the left is for it, but the reaction on the right is this kind of confusion. After 4 or 5 years of Trump and everything else, you would think there'd be more people, even among the base, who would see clearly what's going on. What they're doing is pressuring private corporations to do the bidding of the government. It's not long before they make the laws, regulate corporations to regulate speech. They're not quite there yet, but we're watching this play out before our eyes. And I don't know if you guys saw Tucker the other night, have lots of people call and text me and say, this is an incredible hour of TV. I mean, he was raising the warning signs of this crisis. You have even people like Naomi Wolf are on the air saying, this is really happening in America, and this is going on in front of our face, right? And so I don't know where it ends. I mean, we're not in a situation that's in any sense a normal political time, and increasingly, I think people realize how extreme the situation is. But what you say, Spencer, is exactly the case. I mean, either you see that this is outrageous. They're doing exactly what happened over and over again in the last century that led to totalitarian government and terrible things and deaths and torture and everything else. And it's all it's all flowing step by step, or you don't. And I don't know. I mean, I totter every day between, I don't know about you guys. I'm curious to see where you're at between doomerism, which seems very logical, and also a sense that there are a lot of people who do see this, and there actually could be some kind of backlash. I hate to say that, because to me that sounds like a boomer saying, like, there'll be a backlash and it's going to get better. And as our friend and colleague Michael Anton always has pointed out before everyone else, who deserves much credit, and I'll defend him till my dying day. But he would say, they told me there's going to be a backlash for years, and there never has been, which is true. It's so bad, I almost think like maybe there will be one. I don't know. I mean, if there's not, though, this country is going to roll under.
The question is it the late 40s and early 50s in the Soviet Union, Matt, or is it the late 80s? I think that's and it's been a theme for us in recent.
Well, hold on. Is it also is it the 1830s or the 1850s? Right?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, and yeah, it's been a theme of us in recent months. Is all this frenetic pedal mashing to the floor a sign of weakness or a sign of strength? It's a good question. I mean, there's no doubt though that the left is ascendant. It controls all three branches of government. Well, not all three, but the two really important ones on the national political scene. Maybe barely with Congress and this razor-thin Senate majority of Kamala, but and then as we see the allied corporate power, where our friend Helen Roy, I think, said on Twitter yesterday or the day before, and she's not the first to say it. It's completely feasible for us to see corporate enforced with a wink and nod, maybe even a nudge behind the scenes from government of a social credit system. It's happening before our eyes. While at the same time, one of your themes, Matt, there seems to be signs of life on the right and a real attempt to build alternative institutions. I was just actually at lunch today with a friend and a supporter of Claremont, and it was at his club in Pasadena. We haven't dined in a year because we haven't been able to, so we took advantage of it. And his friend, who was who's a money manager, actually a bond trader, bond manager, said he just had enough at his place that he's worked for 16 years. He quit. He was semi-retired. He'll figure out what he's doing next because of all the woke race training business. And then he mentioned to my friend, you should know about this group. They're trying to put a group together where they put together investment products that are anti-woke. And it's a version of things that are happening all across the market. And it was actually one of the themes on, I think, that very same Clubhouse room Matt and I were in, somebody saying, look, you all can complain about this all you want, but the materials are out there to build alternative institutions, to build your own hardware. In the case of tech, it's not easy to build your own banks, do it all. The state will come down on you in our current environment, but we need to be branching out and diversifying in various ways. And there's a huge market opportunity in various sectors. And I suspect people are working hard to seize it.
Yeah, Ryan, that's right. I admit I snuck a spicy esoteric teaching into my most recent column for the American Mindset, our beloved Substack, to which one and all should subscribe. And since it was smuggled away into the Substack for only our purest and most noble of fans. It was not greeted with a wall-to-wall inbox full of hosannas. So I will make it an exoteric teaching now, live to tape on the podcast. It sure seems to me like our regime is behaving as if it considers itself to be quite weak. And yes, it has concentrated power to a ridiculous degree. And yes, it has this ridiculous array of tools at its disposal. And yes, it has sort of like monopolized so much of the channels of official communication. And yet, there's so much for people to do, and there's such a spirit and an energy among people who are starting to realize that they don't need to rely on these institutions, that they can walk away from these institutions. And yeah, some people might get canceled, and yeah, that's like a serious problem. But I think that the experience that many people are having is one where either the risk of cancellation is worth running, or there's life after cancellation, and in fact, it's a lot better than what you got when you were unceremoniously thrown out of, this decadent, corrupt, declining, consolidating industry or sector that you find yourself in. And so how can it be that this is happening, if indeed it is happening? Part of the answer, of course, is the way that technology has disrupted the mode of rule of our established elite. But I really think that that so far it seems like Donald Trump being president for 4 years sort of gave the ruling class so much to worry about, so much to fight about, and so much to have to message that the American people, in a sense, kind of got out from under them and we acquired some time to devote toward turning inward and creating new ventures and plowing our energies into fertile soil that we would not have had Trump not been in office even for just the 4 years.
Yeah, this is a good example of why everybody should subscribe to the American mindset. In fact, Ryan and I were talking earlier on also a podcast on the Substack about the incredible disappearing Joe Biden, and like, why do I at least feel as if I'm just not hearing about Joe? And there are a number of factors in that which are not particularly exciting or salutary for the right. One of them is that the press, as Seth indicated, is kind of a PR firm, a massive national PR firm for Biden that's drawing attention away from his worst excesses. Another is that he is potentially a bit doddering and kind of at the mercy of various forces that are beyond his control. So he's just not a very compelling figure. But I do think there is a final aspect of this, which speaks to what James is talking about, which is that actually, in my heart of hearts, at a deep intuition level, I feel it is more consequential what the GameStop Reddit bros decide to do next than what the Biden administration decides to do next. And by consequential, I don't mean that like Biden can't have many terrible effects on our lives, just that the amount of energy that is mounting, and dare I say it, vitality or even vitalism among these sort of dissident renegade groups, which are, like it or leave it, empowered in new ways by digital technology and empowered in ways that won't ultimately be suppressible for good and all. All of that, all of the youth, all of the interest, all of the energy does seem to be gravitating toward and localizing in not even just conservatives so much as like people that want to live sane, healthy, natural lives. And this sort of tottering, weird, scaffolded regime, which has like formed itself like a carapace over our national life, seems fragile to me as well.
I just want to, I want to echo that and just say some positive things for our listeners who are out there in a, in an admittedly very dark time. And that is, the role, the perch that I'm in now, which I'm very, thankful for, is both with Claremont and in creating some new ventures to talk to a lot of people every day. And a lot of them are inside the Borg. A lot of them are inside the system. And what I'll just tell you is that there are a ton of people who are inside of companies, organizations that you would never imagine. if you're listening to this and you're kind of, based listener, you're against what's going on, you're against the narrative. I mean, there are Swiss cheese holes all throughout the organizations that you would think are against you, of people who just disagree. They're dissenters and they're quiet. And what you see in the last 9 months is a movement of those people, as Ryan's describing, towards, I'm done with this. I'm done with this. I am going to do something else. I'm going to use my resources and my talent to build something else. So I don't know where that goes. I'm a realist about this. It still doesn't look very good, the situation, to me. But you do have people, you would be shocked. I mean, listeners would be shocked. People who work for organizations and businesses that you would say, what? Really? Someone who works for there at that level disagrees? And they do. And they're moving, and they're being activated. And so I would say, as another silver lining in all this, the last battles we're not even close to being fought yet. So regardless of where all this goes, this rolling revolution, this threatening to roll the country under in a one-party state, there are all kinds of people who have not even, fully gotten out of the Borg and fought yet, and they fully disagree. And what's happened since the election and since January 6th is that everyone who knows what's going on has a sense of it. Whether it's young friends like our guy, Sarab Sharma, just started an organization called American Moment, which we're very friendly with. It's a very good idea. He's one of many starting new organizations. Whether it's people in tech or in finance who see the problem and are moving towards creating new businesses. There's this explosion of energy since the election, and it is like someone just slammed on the gas in the Lambo, and the wheel, you can't even hear it spinning yet. It's just revving up. And so the counter revolution in my mind is just beginning. And really for Claremont, I think it's kind of the same way. So I'm not, I guess what I would say is, if you've already wrapped your mind around the seriousness of the problem, the actual resolution of this, the actual battles and war is yet to unfold. And it's not going to be as simple as some of these clowns on the left think it is.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. On that hopeful note, and I share your sentiments, it's time to build, and we'll continue to talk about all this and to do our part to make all of it possible. So thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to support our work, visit claremont.org/donate. If you want to learn more about all of our projects and writing, go to our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, and claremontreviewbooks.com, and our brand new Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. Rate, review, share, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks to the production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon and Annalisa Lee. And thank you to you all. See you all next week.